Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam has publicly apologised for her government's handling of a controversial extradition bill which sparked massive protests. Mrs. Lam says that she accepts that her administration's shortcomings are to blame for the public unrest, but she did not cave in to demands for her resignation.
I have heard you loud and clear and have reflected deeply on all that has transpired. The concerns over the past few months have been caused by deficiencies in the work of the SAR government over the amendment exercise. I personally have to shoulder much of the responsibility. This has led to controversies, disputes and anxieties in society. For this, I offer my most sincere apology to all people of Hong Kong.
It's her second apology in just a matter of days after the city was rocked by its biggest protests ever. The demonstrations began in opposition to the proposed extradition bill that would allow suspects to be sent to mainland China for trial. But they soon evolved into larger protests, calling for Mrs. Lam to step down.
And our correspondent Roland Lim joins us now from Hong Kong. Roland, you know she's apologized publicly, so what's been the reaction to this?
Yeah, the Civil Human Rights Front, the group that organized the 2 million strong march on Sunday, said that an arrogant Mrs. Lam had wasted everybody's time by calling for a media briefing and then completely ignoring the demands. And the front says that the people of Hong Kong are still very angry that she refuses to withdraw the extradition bill completely and that she won't step down to take accountability over the political turmoil she's created, and that she won't be holding the police accountable for their response to clashes on Wednesday. They're now going to be discussing with their members, NGOs, as well as the Pan-Democratic camp tomorrow to formulate their next plan of action. That's likely to be revealed on Wednesday at the earliest. Reaction from politicians fell along party lines. The Pan-Democratic legislators are very unhappy with what she had to say, insisting that Mrs. Lam had failed to meet their demands similar to that of the front. Its convener, Claudia Mo, said that she managed to at least lose her smug and arrogant face, but then her supposedly genuine apology comes a little too late. On the other side of the political divide, the pro-establishment DAB party, the biggest party in Hong Kong, its chairwoman, Starry Lee, said that she accepts Mrs. Lam's apology and that she believes that most of Hong Kong people don't want this thing to drag on because it isn't good for Hong Kong society as a whole. Meanwhile, the Hong Kong General Chamber of Commerce, now, they're the group that successfully lobbied for changes to the bill, such as the exemption of most white-collar crimes. It said that it hopes the city can now put this behind them and move forward positively.
Roland, Mrs. Lam has asked for another chance to lead Hong Kong. Will protesters be willing to give that to her?
Well, extradition bill protesters that gathered around the Legislative Council demonstration zone was listening to her press conference, greeted Mrs. Lam's speech with boos, so that's not a good sign. Again, saying the apology offered by the chief executive was insincere, that she had failed to address many of their demands. They say they lost trust in the Hong Kong leader, so she must step down. They also want her to release the 5 protesters accused of rioting during the last Wednesday's clashes with police and vow to continue their sit-in at LegCo until Mrs. Lam addresses their demands. Whether Mrs. Lam will or will not resign, well, as former LegCo President Zhang Yoksing put it, the resignation is not up to her. She is appointed by the central government, so for her to step down requires very high-level discussion and deliberation. The central government, at the same time, does not want to set a precedent that people power can actually depose a high-ranking Chinese official from his or her post. As a government pro-insider said, was quoted as saying, it would create more problems than it solves at all sorts of levels, such as the resignation would send a signal of weakness on the part of the central government and also make future chief executive vulnerable to such public pressures, also making it harder to find willing and able candidates for the next election. So, while there's never been a precedent for a chief executive to step down, we did have a former chief executive, Tung Chee-hwa, stepping down months later after 500,000 people protested against the Article 23 national security legislation, citing ill health. Unpopular leader C.Y. Leung, who took a hardline stance against the Occupy movement, and some say wasn't Beijing's first choice in the first place to be CE, he wasn't allowed to run for a second term.
Roland, you know she's promised not to restart the legislative process, but she also hasn't withdrawn the extradition bill. So where does it leave the bill then?
Yeah, she was asked this time and time again during the media briefing by reporters. She said that she refused to withdraw the bill, but she stressed that her government has already suspended the legislative process and promises not to proceed again until, until she's addressed all the people's fears. Now, she also admitted that it's very unlikely that the government can retable the bill before the current legislative term ends next year, which is in 2020. Political watchers say that it would be absolute political suicide to bring it back again after that, with so much anger on the streets over the bill. So suspension, say analysts, actually means a withdrawal. I remember the case of the unpopular Article 23 national legislation when 500,000 people took to the streets to protest against this. Well, then Chief Executive Tong Chee-hwa, he also delayed the second reading of that bill, promised a public consultation, but after months later withdrew it completely. Subsequent administrations under Donald Tsang as well as C.Y. Leung have not revisited that Article 23 bill again. So likewise, many predict that Lam's suspension of this bill will likely follow the same path, and her initial announcement really basically a face-saving U-turn for the government.
Thanks for that update, Roland Lim, speaking to us from Hong Kong.
Let's give you a bit of background then. Mrs. Lam has gradually softened her stance ever since protests over her extradition bill erupted. Here's how events have unraveled so far.
Let's start with June 9, and that's when protests first broke out. An estimated 1 million people turned out on the streets. Mrs. Lam's response was firm. A day later, she said the extradition bill would not be scrapped and maintained that the bill would help to uphold justice, calling it very important.
On June 12th, the Hong Kong government was forced to postpone the second reading of the bill after demonstrators blocked key routes around the city's parliament. The protests turned violent, with the police firing tear gas and rubber bullets at demonstrators. Authorities declared it a riot. Mrs. Lam retreated for the first time on June 15th, announcing the bill's suspension.
So on Sunday, an estimated 2 million people marched through the streets of Hong Kong in the biggest protest the city has ever seen. Now, Mrs. Lam didn't appear in public, but instead issued an apology in the form of a government statement where she said sorry for causing controversy and disputes in Hong Kong society. But it seems that it was too little too late for protesters who wanted her to step down.
That brings us to today. Mrs. Lam apologizing publicly in person as demanded. She said she would personally shoulder responsibility for the conflict, but stopped short of resigning.